So the first 2 episodes of Amazon's Rings of Power series are finally here, which means I can finally give my thoughts on what I think about this series. I'm not really a hardcore Tolkien fan. My knowledge of the world of Middle-earth is limited to that of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series, though anything beyond that I'm not as familiar with. So what did I think about this series set during the creation of the Rings of Power? Well, it managed to be not as terrible as I expected, but based on the first 2 episodes, I'm still not really impressed with what this show has to offer. The best part of this show is easily the visuals. You can definitely tell that the budget put into them definitely paid off. The digital artists did an amazing job of bringing Middle-earth to life. However, just because a show has amazing CGI doesn't mean it's going to be good, as it still requires work to be put into the story and characters, which this show hasn't really done. The story of this series is about the rise of Sauron and how he created the Rings of Power. However, going off of the first 2 episodes, you wouldn't really know that's what this series is about, as these first 2 episodes do a really terrible job at establishing what the story's going to be for this season. All we really know is that in the past there was a war between the elves and Morgoth, and that after the defeat of Morgoth, Sauron fled and has been in hiding. Now the elves are trying to track down Sauron and defeat him once and for all so that they can finally go home. That's the premise that this show starts off with, and it doesn't really expand from there in the first 2 episodes. If you're unfamiliar with the world of Middle-earth, then I can definitely see you feeling like nothing really happened in this series so far. Now you'd think all this time would be spent to build up the characters instead. However, that also isn't the case. This show suffers from having far too many characters split between multiple stories, and not having the time to focus enough on each one of them. The first story that we're introduced to is Galadriel's. All we really know about her character and story within these first 2 episodes is that she is obsessed with vengeance and needs to defeat Sauron in order to avenge her brother. The second storyline follows Elrond as he works with Celebrimbor to build Middle-earth's most impressive forge, while negotiating with the dwarves so that they can accomplish this nearly impossible feat. The other 2 plotlines follow completely original characters. The third plotline follows the hobbits of this story, known as Harfoots at this point in the timeline. The main character of this story is Elenora, known as Nori, which seems like a very poor name for the creators to go with, especially with an original character, seeing as Nori is already one of the dwarves in The Hobbit who accompanied Thorin. So why they would choose to reuse this name for an original character was quite confusing. So far in Nori's plotline, she has found a mysterious old man who fell from the sky in a meteor, who is presumably Gandalf. This plotline feels the most like a Tolkien story, seeing as it starts the way that Tolkien's 2 major stories started, with Gandalf encountering the hobbits and bringing them off on a mission with him. The fourth storyline follows an original elf character whose name I don't remember, and a human woman who he is in love with, whose name I also don't remember. Within these first 2 episodes, the 2 of them discover a tunnel underneath their town in which orcs have been burrowing through and have been using these tunnels to abduct humans. The only one of these stories that I was really interested in seeing was that of Elrond's, as he negotiates with the dwarves. As for the others, I found them to be rather forgettable, and when the story would switch over to one of them, I'd always be like, oh yeah, they exist. With the show being split amongst so many stories, none of them really get a chance to develop the characters, and so they all just sort of feel forgettable. Honestly, the only reason that Galadriel and Elrond managed to stand out is because they are already pre-established characters who the audience will likely know. If you took away the fact that they are established characters, then they would be just as forgettable as the rest of the cast. And so the fact that these characters are so dull makes it very hard to get invested in this story when we technically already know where it leads. If you want to know how this series ends, then just watch the beginning of The Fellowship of the Ring, where we get to see the first defeat of Sauron and the loss of the One Ring, as that is inevitably where this series is going to end up. For characters like Elrond and Galadriel, we know they're going to survive because they're in Lord of the Rings. And as for Durin and the Mines of Moria, well, we already know what happens in Moria. And, well, spoilers for Durin, I guess, but the Balrog that the Fellowship encounters within Moria has the title of Durin's Bane. So obviously in this series we're going to watch as Durin's dwarves uncover the Balrog and inevitably watch the Balrog kill Durin. And then there's the original characters, who I just don't care enough about to see where their story goes, or get invested in them as of now. So because these characters are so forgettable, and we already know where this story goes, I'm just not invested in this show at all. Sure, it looks pretty, but there's absolutely no substance to it. When you look at Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, you can see how much passion went into that project, and making sure it was the best possible adaptation of Lord of the Rings. Everything from the characters to the sets, even the music, was perfect. It may not have had a budget as large as Amazon series, yet still managed to create something that I think is worthy of the Lord of the Rings title. So while Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings had to put in actual effort to gain recognition as a fantasy series at a time when fantasy wasn't popular, and then you go over and look at Rings of Power, and you can tell that Amazon just wanted to throw a bunch of money at this project and hope that this ridiculously large budget would be enough to create something as iconic as the original Lord of the Rings. And if that did not happen to be the case, then they could at least use the Lord of the Rings name as a crutch to still get people to watch it regardless. Now, to me, perhaps the most disrespectful thing about this series is that it doesn't feel like a project with passion put into it by people who care about doing Tolkien's work justice, but rather it feels more like mindless content. Now, what I mean by this is that, at least in the first 2 episodes of this series, it didn't really feel like it was trying to tell an engaging story, but more so like this show was leaving out hooks to get content creators to make videos so that they can act as free publicity for this series. A lot of the world building in this series is left intentionally vague, I think. The whole war with Morgoth is just briefly mentioned at the beginning of the first episode. We don't even get to see Morgoth or have it explained what he truly is. All we know is that he is some sort of Dark Lord. There's also references to things such as the Silmarils, and a lot of mysteries left open by the end of these 2 episodes, such as who the man falling from the sky was, which is clearly Gandalf, or who the person in the boat that picks up Galadriel is, which my guess is that it's Isildur. There's also the mystery of what Durin found at the end of episode 2, which is most likely the heart of the mountain, which will awaken the Balrog. And then there are characters such as Durin and Celebrimbor, who Elrond is already acquainted with. So when we are first introduced to them, we are expected to already know who they are because Elrond already knows who they are. As I was watching these episodes, I couldn't help but feel that a lot of these points were left vague intentionally so that people would make videos and articles about them, which would lead to free publicity for this series for Amazon. It's unclear if Amazon will continue with this vague world building in order to get more people to make free content for them, or if this was just for the first 2 episodes. Although knowing how meticulous Tolkien was with his world building, I'm sure that the way this show handled it would be very insulting to him, as this series leaves the most important aspects of world building to be explained in separate videos and articles that other people will create, rather than finding a natural way to implement it into the story. By the end of these first 2 episodes, I had definitely felt like I had watched 2 hours of things happening, but it didn't feel like a lot of things had happened within those 2 hours. If you took this story and completely separated it from the works of Tolkien, you'd be left with a generic fantasy story that no one really cares about. As of now, I'm hoping that the series begins to pick up. However, seeing as we are already a quarter of the way through the series, and not much has really happened, I don't have high hopes for the rest of it, but we'll just have to see if this show can manage to pick itself up, or if it's just going to continue being a generic fantasy story with Tolkien's world and characters lazily slapped on top of it, and the Lord of the Rings title thrown onto it in order to draw as many people as possible to the series. But what have you thought about the show so far, if you've even watched it? Let me know in the comments, and until next time, thanks for watching.